In the year ending March 2021, more often than not, female homicide victims were killed by a partner, ex-partner, or family member. For males, it was slightly different. The suspects in male homicides was typically a friend, acquaintance, or an other known person to the victim. Of the 114 domestic homicides in the year ending March 2021, 67 victims were killed by a partner or ex-partner. This episode focuses on a case from 2011 which involved a husband murdering his wife, although they were separated at the time, in the Bedfordshire town of Flitwick. Stick around to hear more.
You are now listening to British Murders, the True Crime Podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to British Murders, the channel that focuses exclusively on British murder cases and serial killers. I'm your host Stuart Blues and this is the third episode of my 7th season. One of my listeners suggested this case via Instagram, but they did ask to remain anonymous, so I am going to honour their wishes. This story takes place in the Bedfordshire town of Flitwick, as I alluded to at the start. And I must say it is a pretty small town. As of the 2011 census, the estimated population of Flitwick was 12,998. Before we get into it, let me quickly advise that this podcast contains themes that may be upsetting to some viewers. Listener discretion, as always, is advised. It's been a difficult case to research this one, purely because there's not that many articles out there about this case. If you type Lee Anstice murder or Tracy Anstice murder in Google, you'll get probably 2 pages worth of research. It can make it difficult to tell a story without adding too much filler or feeling that you're adding unnecessary information. The really difficult part, though, the bit that sort of frustrated me the most, was the lack of information about Tracy Anstice. She's the unfortunate victim in this case, and I do like to try and focus on the victims rather than the actual killer, the suspect, perpetrator, whatever you want to call him. It just wasn't possible in this, frustratingly. What I do know about Tracy is that she was a loving mother. She was a fantastic mum to her only child, which was a daughter. She meant the absolute world to Tracy. She worked within an area of the South Essex Partnership University NHS Foundation Trust. That's a bit of a mouthful. It's more commonly known as SEPT or SEPT, which is how I'll refer to it for the rest of this video. SEPT was an NHS Foundation Trust that provided mental health, learning disability, social care and community services across Bedfordshire, Essex, Luton and Suffolk. Tracy was so proud of her job. She had the opportunity to help so many people who were less fortunate than others. At the time of this week's events, August 2011, Tracy Anstice was 37 years old. It's now time for me to introduce the villain of this episode. He was born in Oxfordshire, South East England in 1961, and his name, as I've already mentioned, is Lee Anstice, spelled Anstice. Sibling-wise, I know that Lee at the very least had a brother, but information about his parents and the rest of his family was scarce. Sometimes with a lot of these, I call them local murder cases, you will have some news outlets that report them. It's typically regional newspaper websites, but you don't really find out too much about the killer or the victim, purely because this is perhaps the first crime they've committed. They've not been in the police system. So providing a detailed background on them, it can be quite difficult, to be honest. So we're just going to have to sort of skip ahead to when Lee left school, because that's when the story picks up. That's when the availability, resource-wise, begins. He left school at the age of 18. I don't know how he got on, but he managed to secure a job working for the civil service after he'd finished his studies, which makes me think he probably did all right. He can't have done too terribly. He didn't spend too long in the civil service at that time. The job just wasn't for him, so he transitioned into the armed forces. He joined the RAF and he spent a total of 9 years there. While working in places such as Saudi Arabia as an aircraft instructor, Lee met and married his first wife. He was 22 when they married, and the couple went on to have 2 children. In the early 90s, Lee stopped working for the RAF and he rejoined the civil service. Why did he do that? Did he hate the civil service? I don't know. I don't know how he left the RAF either. Might have been discharged honourably. No idea. Maybe he just didn't fancy it. I don't know how the RAF works. The timing of when he left, though, is basically a couple of years after the Gulf War ended in 1991. By 1994, his first marriage had ended, and in May of that year, Lee took an excessive amount of tablets in an attempt to end his own life by way of an overdose. His marriage failing was said to be the key trigger. When the attempt failed, Lee spoke with his GP, who in turn referred him to a secondary mental health service. Primary services include stuff like your GP, whereas secondary services, they're more specialised mental health teams, and your primary mental health service, like your GP, will refer you to them if they deem it necessary. When someone from a secondary service finally saw Lee, the waiting lists are very long, I'm told, he was only seen by a counsellor on one occasion. That counsellor thought he was fit enough to be discharged back to his GP. The secondary service suggested further counselling, but Lee's issues weren't deemed to be severe enough to warrant him staying under their care at that time. Lee's second marriage was to Tracy, and as I mentioned earlier, the pair had a daughter who was born in 2003. The family lived on Carlisle Close, a cul-de-sac in the Bedfordshire town of Dunstable. It's a stone's throw away from Kensworth Quarry. It's the only thing near I could really find on Google Maps. I think it's quite close to Whipsnade Zoo, maybe a mile or two away from that. Fast forward to the summer of 2011. Lee was approaching his 50th birthday, Tracy was 37, and the daughter will have been 7 or 8. The couple's marriage had deteriorated greatly, mainly due to Lee's possessive and controlling behaviour. He was constantly jealous of his wife. In particular, it was the number of friends she had and the love she received from them that caused his jealousy. As a result, he became overbearing and overprotective when it just wasn't necessary. In Lee's head, Tracy was being unfaithful to him. He believed she was having an affair with another man. I can't confirm the exact date or month of this, but the pair separated in early 2011. Tracy moved out of the family home and took the pair's daughter with her. They didn't get divorced at that point, though. As I'm sure you know, divorces can get very, very complicated. They can take a lot of time. So they remained legally married, but for all intents and purposes, they separated. That's how Tracy saw it anyway. Lee, on the other hand, took the separation incredibly badly and could not come to terms with it at all. He refused to accept that his wife no longer wanted to be with him, and his journey over the next few months would lead to tragedy. Wanting to move on with her life and reportedly looking happier than ever after the separation, Tracy met a man named Glenn Feasey, and the pair started a relationship. That was in either May or June 2011. Like Tracy, Glenn had also had a marriage that had broken down, so they had that in common. Tracy was in the process of speaking to divorce lawyers during the summer of 2011, but the process wouldn't even get the chance to get off the ground thanks to the husband she so wanted out of her life. The events I'm about to tell you occurred from mid-June to August 2011. The details come from a report published in May 2015 following an independent investigation into the care and treatment of Lee Anstice, who in the report is referred to as Mr. Z. It was written for NHS England, Midlands and East by Verita. There's a link to the full report in this episode's references, which you can find on britishmurders.com/Lee Anstice. In early June 2011, it might have been the 13th, Lee paid his GP a visit. He said that he was having suicidal thoughts and said he'd even considered leaving a suicide note, but he couldn't go through with it. Lee said he'd felt depressed and suicidal since March 2011, so that's probably the time when Tracy and their daughter left the house. Would make sense, wouldn't it? It was revealed during that initial GP visit that Lee had previously sought help and received treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, known more commonly as PTSD, as a result of his experiences during the Gulf War. He was also reportedly suffering from PTSD due to his child's health, but Lee had 3 children, 2 from his first marriage, remember. I'm not sure which child that claim refers to, or what the problem was, if one of them had underlying health issues, or perhaps he was just paranoid about them getting ill. It's not really clear, so it's not really relevant to the story. On June 17th, 2011, Lee wrote a suicide note addressed to Tracy, who was out with their daughter. Once he'd finished writing it, he called her and told her what he planned to do. After cutting their mummy-daughter time short, Tracy rushed home and read the note from Lee. To get some advice, she rang her colleagues at Sept, who suggested that she take Lee to A&E. He was subsequently taken to Luton and Dunstable Hospital's A&E department, where a Sept mental health liaison nurse assessed him. The nurse was from the Crisis Resolution and Home Treatment Team, or CRHT, one of the secondary mental health services I alluded to earlier. During the assessment, Lee said to the nurse, and to Tracy, who was also present, that his mental health struggles came from the marriage breaking down. Lee confessed to having told all of this to his young daughter, who had in turn informed her teachers. The teachers took the necessary safeguarding action and reported the situation to Child Services. Because Tracy worked within Sept, it was considered a potential conflict of interest to have Lee gain access to a hospital bed within the areas it covers: Bedfordshire, Essex, Suffolk, Luton. Therefore, it was recommended that Lee be sent to an out-of-area hospital. He was transferred to a 38-bed acute inpatient mental health unit called the Campbell Centre, which is in Milton Keynes in Buckinghamshire. Lee's initial assessment put him at a moderate to high risk of suicide and deliberate self, which meant that he would be placed under near-constant surveillance. A psychiatrist diagnosed him with acute stress disorder. Lee spent 3 days in the Campbell Centre before being discharged on June 20th, 2011. Bizarrely, Lee was discharged into the care of Luton and South Bedfordshire's CRHT team, which falls within the areas serviced by SEPT. He was seen daily and still admitted to having thoughts about ending his own life, but the thoughts occurred less frequently than they had a few days earlier. Crucially, at no point did Lee mention harming Tracy, wanting to harm Tracy, or anyone else for that matter. 2 days later, on June 22nd, 2011, that began to change. During a psychiatric medical review, Lee openly expressed hatred and anger toward Tracy, but he didn't say he wanted to harm her. Lee was on medication by then, most likely the antidepressant sertraline, and the plan was to begin reducing his prescription. 5 days after the medical review, Lee's suicidal thoughts returned. He attempted to take his own life by overdosing on his prescribed medication. He was saved and taken back to Luton and Dunstable Hospital for what is known as acute care. Acute care is where a patient receives active short-term treatment for a condition. It could include treatment for a severe injury, a period of illness, urgent medical conditions, or to recover from surgery. It was agreed that during his stay, Lee was to be reviewed daily by a CRHT liaison nurse. During one of his assessments on June 30th, 2011, Lee was advised to be admitted to a mental health hospital for more specialised treatment. He vehemently refused to be sent there. As a result, he was discharged from Luton and Dunstable Hospital and sent home. The reasoning was that the hospital's clinical team did not deem him to be a high enough risk to be detained under the Mental Health Act 1983. More daily meetings occurred, but to prevent the story from becoming too granular, let's skip ahead to July 7th, 2011. That was when Lee Anstice took another overdose of his prescribed medication. He was found in his bedroom after Tracy contacted the police. She had received a text message from Lee that caused her enough worry to warrant dialing 999. Once more, his life was saved. This time it was saved by Luton and Dunstable Hospital's Medical Intensive Treatment Unit. Lee was admitted to a Hertfordshire inpatient bed at Albany Lodge a few days later and remained there until mid-August. He was discharged from Albany Lodge on August 18, 2011 and moved in with his parents in Oxfordshire. On August 24, 2011, Lee contacted an emergency number he had been provided with should he ever feel unwell. He explained over the phone that he was concerned about his mental health, and he was later contacted by a care coordinator from the South Bedfordshire Community Mental Health Team. An appointment was made for Lee to meet the care coordinator 2 days later, on August 26, 2011. That was scheduled for 3 p.m. August 26th is where the tragic events of this week's case began. Lee missed his appointment with the care coordinator because he had more sinister plans for that day. He also chose to ignore the 3 phone calls made to his mobile phone by the care coordinator. Over in Flitwick, Glenn and Tracy had spent the Thursday evening, August 25th, at his flat. The flat was located roughly 15 minutes away from Tracy's parents' house at Buttermere Close, where her daughter was staying. Somehow, Lee had cottoned on to the fact that Tracy was regularly staying at Glenn's flat, and he decided to use their daughter as bait to lure Tracy into a trap. Lee called Tracy and told her he was going to a parent's house to see their daughter, despite him being ordered to stay away from the family. Glenn said the following about Tracy receiving that phone call from Lee. "She looked up at me and said, 'He's coming to get my daughter.' I said, 'I think you should call the police.' I could sense whatever was going to happen wouldn't be good." Glenn wanted to accompany Tracy to her parents' house, but she insisted he stay at his flat. She felt that any confrontation with Lee would only be escalated if her new partner went along with her. As she set off, Glenn phoned Tracy's mum to explain what had just happened and that her daughter was going to her house. After calling Tracy, Lee made his way to the house and parked outside. Perhaps he was already there when he made the phone call. As Tracy's car pulled up, Lee got out of his and removed a knife from his pocket. He had visited a local supermarket earlier in the day to purchase it. Tracy was heading towards the house when Lee called out to her from behind. He had cornered her between 2 parked cars outside the house. She had no way of escaping. Lee attacked Tracy with the knife, stabbing her 4 times. One of the strikes was to her chest and pierced her heart. Tracy's parents heard the screams coming from their daughter as their stepson attacked her, so they phoned the police in terror. It does get worse. Lee and Tracy's daughter witnessed the entire thing. Once the police had been called, Tracy's mum Patricia called Glenn and screamed down the line, "He's killed her! Lee stabbed her!" The paramedics arrived shortly after the attack and worked on Tracy as best they could. She was taken to a nearby hospital but sadly succumbed to her injuries that afternoon. In one last act of pure evil, Lee sent Tracy's phone a text that read, "Are you taking her back for happy families? Not now." He was referring to their young daughter. Lee evaded police capture for just over a day. He was caught and arrested on Sunday, August 28, 2011, after his car was spotted in the Bedfordshire village of Westerning. He had clearly been preparing for his capture because he revealed to officers during questioning that some voices in his head had told him to hurt Tracy so she could feel the pain that she'd caused him. He'd never mentioned such a thing throughout his time at mental health units. It seems to be a common thing that murderers do that. It's like they want to get a lesser sentence or more lenient sentence and charge of manslaughter by diminished responsibility. So they try and say they hear voices even though we've got quite a lot of evidence, mate, that you're in psychiatric units. You'd never mention that once. In some cases, of course, it will be the truth, but only the killers really know what the truth is. Lee was held on remand for 6 months whilst awaiting his trial. The trial took place at Luton Crown Court and lasted roughly 3 weeks from mid-February to early March 2012. Lee denied murder and claimed not to remember stabbing Tracy. He reiterated that he'd heard voices in his head that had previously told him to hurt his wife, so his mental faculties were severely affected. Thankfully, the jury didn't buy what he was selling and they unanimously found him guilty of murder. Sentencing Judge Richard Foster handed Lee Anstice a life sentence on March 9, 2012, with a minimum term of 24 years. He said in his closing statement, "An aggravating feature is that you chose to kill her where it would be witnessed by her parents and your 8-year-old daughter. That poor girl is the other tragic victim in this case. Your marriage had broken down irretrievably, yet you could not accept that, and you could not accept that you no longer had control over your wife. You used every trick in the book to try to keep her. She did not want you to do anything stupid and wanted you to remain in a relationship with your daughter. You only thought about yourself. You hatched a plot to confront her and kill her, and then possibly kill yourself. With your military training, you knew exactly how to penetrate her heart." After hearing Lee's sentence, the following statement was released on behalf of Tracy's family. "While we are satisfied with today's verdict and that justice has been done, the day Tracy died will forever be etched in our memories. It was the day our lives were torn apart. We are now doing our best to provide for her daughter, and while it is our intention to ensure she grows up as a well-adjusted young lady, she will be living a very different life to the one her mummy had planned for her. The family would like Tracy to be remembered as a beautiful daughter, a wonderful and beloved mummy, a loving sibling to her brother and sister, and an adored auntie to her 3 nieces. Tracy was loved so much and will be missed forever." Senior Investigating Officer DCI Sean O'Neill said, "While I am satisfied with today's verdict, nothing will bring Tracy back or restore her family's faith in the world following the loss of their daughter, sister and mother in such violent and tragic circumstances. We know that Tracy is missed by all who knew her, but I hope that knowing the person responsible for taking her from them has been brought to justice will go some way to help them begin to rebuild their lives." At the start of this episode, I mentioned the May 2015 report written by Verita for NHS England, Midlands and East. Its conclusions were as follows. No evidence was found from Lee's words, actions or behaviour at the time that could have alerted professionals that he might become imminently violent. Lee only expressed hatred for Tracy on one occasion, June 22, 2011, but he never expressed any thoughts of harming his wife and had no history of violence or aggression. He had never presented in a violent, aggressive or intimidating manner to staff during his care and treatment. There's no evidence that he showed any signs of psychotic depression in the 3 weeks before his discharge on August 18th, just over a week before the incident. He was well enough to be treated in the community and could not have been sectioned under the Mental Health Act, and his depressive illness was appropriately treated in the weeks before the incident, and there's nothing to suggest that those involved in his care could have foreseen the incident or changed his treatment to prevent it from happening. As a result of their findings, they concluded that the murder of Tracy Anstice by her husband Lee could have in no way been predicted or prevented. And that was the story of British murderer Lee Anstice. Thanks again to the anonymous listener who suggested that case. Let me know your thoughts about this one in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. You may as well subscribe and turn on your notifications bell while you're at it. Like the video as well if you would please. If you'd like to support the show on Patreon or donate on a one-off basis via Buy Me a Coffee, you can find the links to both of those at my website britishmurders.com. Thank you Stephanie Lewis, Lorraine Purden and Debbie for recently joining the Patreon. As for this week's episode, that's all I've got for you now. Thanks so much for listening. I've been Stuart Blues. This has been British Murders. Until next time, cheerio.